5% of that number, you usually can work with them and, get them across into hypnosis with a lot of effort and maybe return visits to you. But there is a small percentage of people, often people who are very scientific, very supercritical, scientists, for example, who have a difficult time going into hypnosis. So yes, it's not 100% by any means, but most people certainly can experience this wonderful methodology that we have that will allow them to see who they really are.
So what was your first case of when you actually went into this area that we would say was where people go between lives?
Well, this came a few years after my case with the man I just described who was in World War I. Just by way of giving a little background, a middle-aged woman came to me with a presenting problem that centered around her feelings of isolation and loneliness. There was a kind of a disconnection with humanity. For example, Emily, she felt a terrible yearning to be with her old friends. And she's claimed to have seen them in dreams and so forth. Once again here, I was a little sidetracked. I thought, oh, I'm looking at a case of depression here. So during the early stages of her session, I asked her, are there any missing people, any friends you knew at any time in your adult life whom you were missing, And she said no. Later, I took her into her very young childhood, asked if there were missing childhood playmates. She said no. Then we began to explore a number of past lives, starting with her most immediate past life. And a few, very, very few dear friends cropped up, but she kept telling me that most of them were not there and she wanted to see them all together. And this is why she felt so isolated in her current life. Well, at this point, I was getting frustrated like I did with the man who was bayoneted in World War I. And incidentally, Emily, this woman, too, was a very, very receptive hypnosis subject, and she was getting ahead of me. She was very, very deep. So I finally said this. Was there ever a time in your existence when you were not lonely because you were with a group of friends? And that's when she began to cry. And her body shook. She pointed, her eyes were closed, but she pointed to my office wall and says, I see them all now. And of course, the trigger here was group. I had mentioned a group, and she interpreted that to mean her soul group. Mm-hmm. These are souls with whom we are very closely associated with, Emily, from, life to life and between lives. So she said, I see them all now. And we had a long talk about this. And once again, I had chills up and down my back. I was stunned by this revelation that, in fact, it was possible to go between lives and that this area of study could be very, very productive and empowering to clients.
So with her, what was it that she reported seeing or experiencing?
Well, she saw her soul group. And when we explored why they weren't, none of them were with her in her current life, we learned that she had depended on them to a great extent in past lives and was learning more in her newly incarnated bodies, being on her own. She wasn't leaning on them for as much support as she had done in the past because they weren't around. So she was becoming a more independent person, a stronger spirit, if you will, and that was her lesson. And once she understood that, she felt so much better. In fact, she wrote me later how wonderful life had become for her because she had accepted this as something that was purposeful and planned, and therefore she could deal with it. So I think this is one of the advantages of what we do, Emily. It gives reasons and purpose for our existence and the trials that we bear in life, and that's important.
I've read two of your books, Journey of Souls and Destiny of Souls, and it's very interesting to read because you give case histories of a lot of your subjects. And it's interesting to read the progression, certainly between the first and the second book. It seems like everyone's experiences are could be very, very similar. The areas they describe going through between lives are very, very similar in their experiences. And then as we get into the second book, it becomes deeper, some of the information that you're getting.
Right.
It seems like basically when someone dies, they are guided or led to this area and sort of healed from whatever traumas they've been through in this life. Is that correct?
Yes. And the thing about it is, Emily, to answer the first part of this question for you, when I wrote my first book, Journey of Souls, that was published in 1994, I wasn't sure how the public would accept this. I wrote a book rather like a travelogue, which we would start with the death experience and go all the way through to reincarnation in a new life. And I did not go into great detail on a lot of what I knew because I thought perhaps, at least for this first book, I ought to proceed more gently with the information that I had. And by the time I began going on the road doing lecturing and doing talk shows like you and I are doing, people said, "We know that you know more, and Dr. Newton, and we want it." So in 2000, I had my second book published, Destiny of Soul, which was far more detailed treatment of certain aspects of the spirit world that I'd only touched on in Journey of Souls. This book, by the way, won Best Physical Book of the Year at the Chicago Book Exposition in 2001. I was very, very grateful for that. My third book, Life Between Lives, it was a different kind of treatment. This came a few years after Destiny, Emily, and I'll just mention it quickly here to say that this particular book describes the foundation of my research and discoveries in a more systematic, step-by-step fashion. The third book, is designed for two things. One, to help the public understand the process that they will go through if they should choose to have a regression session into the afterlife. And the second was to help professional hypnotherapists understand what they need to do to work with this kind of methodology in their own practice. So they're really, up to now, there are three books. There's another one coming out at the end of the year, which is a book that we're working on with about 30 of my teachers that I've trained and their best cases about the benefits of Life Between Lives regression. It's going to be called Memories of the Afterlife. So I think with these books, Emily, that the public will have a very good understanding of if I can term it as how the spirit world is mapped for them. These represent thousands of cases on my part. Mm-hmm. Decade after decade, I worked on this very, very hard. I didn't even tell my own colleagues about my research. I would work with people, but I didn't go public in those early years. And it wasn't until the first publishing of my Journey of Souls book that finally I decided that I'd had enough information that I could intelligently deal with the skeptics and work with people who had many, many questions. And it took that long to develop this pantheon of spirituality. So that's kind of the evolution of my books.
So going back to the experiences, we established that most people will have described to you very, very similar experiences, very similar areas. Can you tell us a bit about, for example, the steps? Say a person dies, their body dies. What do they normally experience at that point?
Well, two things. First of all, I need to say this, Emily. It depends on the advancement of the soul that I'm working with as a client, or that I used to work with. If you're working with someone who's been around for thousands of years and is incarnated in many bodies,